terrorists and the Baathists hope to weaken our will. Our will cannot be shaken. We're being tested, and America and our allies will not fail. We will honor the sacrifice of the fallen by ensuring that the cause for which they fought and died is completed. And we will make America safer by helping to transform Iraq from an exporter of violence and terror into a center of progress and peace.
As the Iraqi army defenses collapsed in the face of the invasion, coalition troops moved rapidly to secure Iraq's most valuable asset, its vast oil fields. Meanwhile, the nuclear and chemical weapons, which were the stated reason for the war, were nowhere to be found. Likewise, Iraq's estimated 1 million tons of conventional weapons and ammunition, the source of nearly every attack on American soldiers in Iraq, were left unguarded.
The wealth generated from the sale of oil belongs to the Iraqi people. And of course the oil of Iraq belongs to the Iraqi people. All resources of Iraq belong to the Iraqi people.
Well, Iraq's oil revenues are for the Iraqi people.
Oil belongs to the Iraqi people. It's their asset.
There are extreme elements that use religion to achieve objectives. And they want us to leave, and they want to topple government. They want to extend an ideological caliphate that has no concept of liberty inherent in their beliefs. They want to control oil resources, and they want to plot and plan and attack us again. That's their objectives.
Anyone who denies that oil resources in the region generally lie at the heart of this issue is simply deluded, or is really kind of in the grip of some sort of neurotic denial.
Some have launched irresponsible charges. They say that we act because of oil.
I mean, as I've said many times in the past, can one really imagine this war taking place if the principal export of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait were dates instead of petroleum? I don't think so.
To Basra and all Iraq comes good news with the opening of a new oil field. The pipeline runs across the desert to the Persian Gulf at Fayum. There, tankers load up with the precious fuel the world needs so bad. Yes, it's a big day for Iraq, and there's a feast to celebrate. Sheep stuffed with rice and a host of other good things. But that's only the first of the good things that will come to Iraq, thanks to oil.
Oil has been a major factor in shaping Middle East policy since it was first discovered in Iran in 1908. When war broke out in 1914, Turkey, which controlled most of the Arab world, was allied with Britain's enemy, Germany. Although bogged down in trench warfare in Europe, British forces successfully occupied much of the Middle East, driving out the Turks. And by 1918, Britain had occupied Iraq, installing a monarch, King Faisal, as the nominal head of state. In 1927, oil was also found in Iraq by a British-French consortium, and soon Iran and Iraq became the primary sources of oil in the Middle East. Later, as a result of political and commercial pressure, the U.S. secured an entry to the oil-producing areas of the Middle East. But to control oil prices, the big three oil companies, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil, retarded developments in Iraq in order to prolong the period before Iraq's entry into the world's oil market. During the 1930s, the big three opposed pipeline construction on the grounds that additional production would upset the world oil market. And after World War II, the U.S. and U.K. oil companies continued to restrict production in Iraq, in spite of repeated protest by their French partner and by the Iraqi government. In 1945, the Arab League was formed, ushering in a new era of Arab nationalism. By 1960, 25% of the world's entire oil supply was coming from the Middle East. In 1958, Iraqi army officer Abdul Karim Qasim led a coup that toppled the British-controlled Iraqi government. But Qasim hastened to assure the United States and Britain that the new regime would not nationalize the oil fields. However, in quick succession, Iraq withdrew from treaties with Britain, ordered foreign military units out of Iraqi bases, and canceled agreements with the United States. Iraq now looked mainly to France and to the Soviet Union for assistance in implementing its national oil policy. Significantly, in 1960, OPEC, a cartel of oil-producing states, was formed by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, and Iraq also became a member in the same year. Saudi Arabia, having the largest oil reserves, assumed the leadership. This organization was to become the most powerful factor in controlling international oil supply and price. In 1963, Iraq's left-leaning Prime Minister Qassim was overthrown by the Ba'ath Party, of which Saddam Hussein was a member. U.S. intelligence helped the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party seize power. In an attempt to strengthen the economy, the Baathists limited the Iraq Petroleum Company, IPC, which was dominated by British and American interests, to its current producing areas, opening up 99% of Iraq to other parties. And in 1964, the government established the Iraq National Oil Company, INOC, to operate in areas confiscated from the IPC. A 1966 study of the petroleum exploration in these areas revealed enormous untapped reservoirs of oil in Iraq. During the 1960s, the region was pressured to keep resources under Anglo-American control. These companies sought concessions, offering a modest royalty on any oil produced, receiving in return the exclusive right to search for oil. U.S. Ambassador Avril Harriman stated, "We could not wish governments, such as Iraq, to get the impression that American oil companies can be pushed around." It was not long, however, before Iraq moved inexorably toward complete nationalization. 45 years after it had drilled its first well in Iraq, the Iraq Petroleum Company lost its rights to vast oil reserves, when on June 1, 1972, all of IPC's properties were nationalized. Meanwhile, the rise of OPEC shifted the balance of power and revenue flows from multinational corporations to oil-exporting states. In retaliation for American support for Israel in the 1973 war, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo, leading to sharp increases in the price and shortages of gas in the United States. In 1979, Iranians overthrew the Western Allied monarchy and ushered in a fundamentalist Islamic regime. Then, in 1980, Iraq attacked Iran over border disputes and fears that Iraq's Shiite majority might be influenced by Iran's revolution. The war was to continue futilely for 8 years, ending only after total casualties had exceeded 500,000. With no military gain, the war was a disaster for Iraq, and from 1988 to 1990, neighboring Kuwait exceeded OPEC's quota, further weakening the crippled Iraqi economy. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, in part as retaliation for its failure to abide by the OPEC quotas and its alleged illegal tapping of Iraqi oil fields. Strict UN sanctions were immediately imposed on Iraq. Then an American-led coalition force attacked, driving the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and in February 1991, Iraq surrendered, leaving Saddam Hussein still in power. From the early 1980s, wars among its members and a glut of oil on the world market weakened OPEC. The UN Oil for Food program, which purportedly allowed Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil for food and humanitarian aid, further burdened this market. The economic threat to the Saudis was severe enough for them to allow oil prices to fall in 1998 to less than $10 a barrel. But in 1999, OPEC regained power as the Saudi-Iranian relationship strengthened, and the Venezuelan nationalist Hugo Chavez was elected president. These factors drove oil prices above $20 a barrel until the first few years of the next century. Until, that is, the start of the second assault on Iraq.
Let's fast forward into the next Bush administration. And in 10 days within the first Bush administration of the current Bush, Cheney held the Cheney Energy Task Force. And in the Cheney Energy Task Force, we have Exxon and Chevron and Halliburton and Bechtel and all of these folks gathering together to design a new oil strategy or energy strategy for the United States. And one of the things that they come up with is a chart that's entitled Foreign Suitors to Iraqi Oil. And this chart lists all the other companies and all the other countries that Saddam Hussein was, in fact, signing oil contracts with for oil under the ground. Saddam was trying to get countries, particularly members of the Security Council, who would take a stand against the sanctions regime. So he was signing contracts with Russia, China, and France.
All the leaders of our government are former executives of petroleum companies, and they certainly know about the oil in Iraq. I mean, after all, Condoleezza Rice was a member of the board of Chevron and had a a ship named after
Was there a conspiracy? Investigative reporter Greg Palast has a theory.
Well, you know, the protesters were in the streets screaming, "No blood for oil, no blood for oil." That was very naive. This war was not about getting oil so that you can fill up your Hummer cheap. That's a complete misunderstanding about what the war in Iraq was about. When I investigated and went to the oil industry guys, they said, look, let's make it simple. The more oil on the market, the lower the price. Now, which government officials happen to come from the oil industry? Let me name two: George Bush, Dick Cheney, and the guy who ran the government at the time, James Baker, the consigliere for ExxonMobil, who also represents, as a lawyer, James Baker represents the Saudi government. They didn't want more oil, they wanted less oil. So we didn't go in there to get the oil, to bring it out, because we needed oil. That's bullshit right now. Let's straighten that out. It was not blood for oil. It was worse. It was blood for no oil. They went in there to shut off the supply. Remember, Saddam wanted to sell. If you wanted more oil, keep Saddam in and remove the sanctions. Because we put a limit on Saddam of 2 million barrels a day. Now, why was that? Was that to feed the people of Iraq? Nah. Because if you want to feed the people of Iraq, you would base the amount of oil sold on its price and the amount of food you could buy. Instead, they put a physical limit. That can only be for one purpose. That was the request of the oil companies. A cap on Iraq's oil output is something that they always wanted to have. And when they knew that those sanctions were going, their fear was not that Saddam would stop selling oil. Their fear was that Saddam would sell more oil. If they lifted the sanctions, he would go from 2 million to 3 to 4 million because he had an OPEC quota that took him up to 3. No problem. So we didn't go in there for the oil, to get the oil. We went in there to make sure we didn't get the oil. Now, there's another problem besides the general dislike of oil companies for having more oil on the market, which is that there's something called OPEC, which is the oil cartel. OPEC has quotas for countries. OPEC has quotas. So Saudi Arabia says, as the leader of OPEC, says, okay, Iran can sell 3 million a day. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela can sell 2.5 million barrels a day. Everyone has a quota, and God forbid you break the quota, because they'll break your nuts. They make the Sopranos look like Mother Teresa. These guys are tough. There's a reason why OPEC works, is that the Saudis have a very strong enforcement mechanism. They'll destroy your economy in a minute. Ask Russia, okay, which opened up its oil spigots and got crushed by the Saudis until they learned. You follow the OPEC diktat. Okay, now, Wolfowitz and gang thought, oh, we're going to go into Iraq and we're going to open up the floodgates. We're going to start pumping 6 million barrels of oil a day. He didn't care what the experts told him, because it's much a political limit as a physical limit. Because OPEC set a cap on Iraq. Bang. It can't be more than what Iran produces. You go up to 4 million, you go up to 6 million barrels a day, you've now busted the OPEC quota. And so Wolfowitz said, and the whole gang said, we're going to pull Iraq out of OPEC. The hell you are. The hell you are. So the oil industry guys out of the James Baker Institute in Florida redrafted the Neocon plan, which was for massive oil, privatize the oil fields. Remember, they're going to privatize the oil fields. Some of the left wing had this goofy idea that they're going to sell off oil fields. They don't sell off oil fields. Oil companies are not capitalists. They're royalists. It stays within the royal sector under complete control. Forget capitalism. Forget free markets. That's not in the oil industry. The oil industry doesn't like it. They need a control. They need a monopoly. So the new plan created, which I got a hold of, I get a hold of this stuff, 323 pages long, confidential, State Department document, written by James Baker's crew, which says they're not going to bust the OPEC quotas. They're going to stay in OPEC, and they're going to, quote, they're going to create a state oil company, a powerful state oil company, forget capitalism, which will have what are called profit-sharing agreements with U.S. oil companies and British oil companies. Cut out the Russians. And what they're going to do is then they're going to stick to the quotas, and the state oil company can quote, this is a quote from the private document, or this the secret document, which says, this plan will enhance the Iraq government's relationship with OPEC. In other words, our government was imposing secretly on Iraq a plan for a state oil company which would be under the lockup control of OPEC and Saudi Arabia, which controls OPEC. That's what it's about. It's about not getting the oil. Again, it's about reducing oil. Let me make it simple in the simplest terms. When George Bush came into office, oil was $18 a barrel, that low. Now it's over $80 a barrel. So $18 a barrel to $80 a barrel. Mission accomplished.
Since 2002, oil prices have risen from less than $20 to over $120 a barrel.
The price of oil is going up and down throughout the world together, driven by world events. It's a fungible commodity. You pay the same price wherever you are, and that price you pay for oil depends on the total quantity produced in the world, regardless of who's producing it, and the total quantity consumed, regardless of who's consuming it.
So we are oil country. Where is all the oil go?
I think it's very vital that people throughout Iraqi society have a claim on this resource and benefit from its development. And that's the key thing to have everybody make the investment to make it pay off.
Any oil deals that are signed with multinational oil companies are not for the benefit of any Iraqis. They will not benefit Iraq. Iraq has so much money, so much exports of oil, that it doesn't really need to expand its oil revenue. In fact, the problem now in Iraq is not the lack of money, it's corruption and occupation.
If you look at the oil-producing world, the countries that have major oil reserves, across the world, all of them are shifting to terms that are much more favourable to the host government, to the host state, and less profitable for foreign oil companies. You see, that's very well known in Venezuela, Bolivia, Russia, Kazakhstan, but the same you can see happening right now in Algeria, Nigeria, even Indonesia. It's happening across the oil-producing world. Now, the one exception to this trend towards more favourable terms for the government and less favourable terms for foreign companies, the one exception is Iraq. Now, of course, the reason for that politically is that Iraq is an occupied country.
It begins to become evident that the urgency attached to the passage of oil legislation by the Iraqi parliament, the urgency indicated by frequent references to how important this legislation is in Washington, has everything to do with the possibility that control over Iraqi oil might slip completely away from the United States.
The oil law was a threat to Iraq's national security. It was a disaster for Iraq's future because it, on the one hand, it privatizes the Iraqi oil and gas, which in Iraq, oil and gas actually are 90 to 95% of the national income. So privatizing 90 to 95% of your income and giving it to multinational oil companies, it's a huge national threat. But other than that, the oil law wanted to decentralize the contracting process of oil contracts with multinational oil companies, opening the doors to partitioning Iraq.
There are really two disputes on oil policy going on within Iraq. One is about the degree of foreign control. To what extent should companies like Exxon and BP be controlling the oil? The other is about centralized control from the federal government in Baghdad versus decentralized, regionalized control by the regional and provincial governments. And these are the two big political issues in Iraqi oil policy. The Kurdish political parties are arguing very strongly that decision-making on oil and the signing of contracts should be done at a regional level, in their case by the Kurdistan Regional Government. Others have argued, in particular oil experts and other politicians have argued that this risks tearing the country apart, fragmenting it and creating a chaotic system where centrifugal forces basically tear the country into pieces.
Now, this conflict has been going on for the last few years, and the US is a major player in it. The US is not watching, the nationalist Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds fight with the separatists, Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds, or like the US is not trying to reconcile them. The United States government has been taking sides. They've been supporting the Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds who are separatists, who want to partition Iraq, and destroying the Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds who are nationalists, who want to keep the Iraqi government united and with a strong central government.
The idea that the oil law is a reconciliation measure is a complete deceit. It's not the first deceit in this war in Iraq, but it is one that is being pushed very hard, and a deceit that has been accepted by most of the commentators on the war. So everyone from President Bush downwards has from time to time described this oil law as a revenue sharing measure. It's a way of determining how oil revenues will be shared between different sectarian groups within Iraq, and supposedly will help bring peace to the country. It's nonsense. That's not what this oil law is about. You only have to read the oil law to see that. It's available on the internet. If you read the oil law, you'll see it has 43 articles in it. Only one of those even mentions revenue sharing, and what that article says, it's Article 11, it says a separate law will determine how revenues are to be shared. It's not the subject of this law. It's entirely separate. Now there is this separate law which is in the stage of drafting and in which the Bush administration has shown almost no interest. Yet at each stage of progress of this oil law, the law about privatising control over Iraq's resources, allowing these long-term contracts to be signed. At each stage of progress, political progress, for example, when the Iraqi cabinet, the cabinet as opposed to the parliament, came to agreement on a draft, President Bush was there and he said, the Iraqi cabinet has reached agreement on how to share oil revenues. That is not what's going on. This is not a law about sharing revenues, it's a law about giving control to foreign companies.
Multinational oil companies have been, going around Iraq like vultures, waiting for the moment to start looting Iraq's oil. They actually have failed until now, so far, which is very surprising. The Iraqi civil society and parliamentarian resistance to stealing Iraq's oil has succeeded in the last 5 years in preventing these multinational oil companies from going to Iraq and starting to steal Iraq's oil. Now, this doesn't really mean that they are not still trying to. I think they will try their best to go to Iraq and try to open, that market for themselves.
Iraq is one of the few places in the world that has a lot of unexplored potential, and really may be one of the big players a few years more down the road.
Well, what's being pursued in Iraq is long-term contracts that would give the likes of ExxonMobil, Chevron and Shell control over oil resources under contracts lasting up to 30 years. Now, the consequence of that for Iraq is that when you bear in mind that oil accounts for 95% of Iraqi government revenues, it is the vast majority of the economy. What we would be seeing is locking in that vast majority of the economy into the control of foreign companies for a generation. Future Iraqi governments, even after the occupation has ended, would be unable to make decisions about how to control their natural resources, how to control their economy. Not only that, the terms of these contracts, the economic terms, would reflect the situation at the time they were signed. So just as happened in Iraq's history, if we look at 1925, when the first contract was signed by the same companies who are trying to sign now. In 1925, Iraq was occupied by the British. They signed a contract for control over all of the oil in the entire country for a period of 75 years on grossly unfair terms. Even after the British control over the country came to an end, the British mandate ended in the 1930s, still Iraqis had to pay out on terms that reflected the fact that Iraq was controlled by the British at the time of signing. Now, I think what we're seeing now is a repetition of history. So under occupation, contracts could be signed which would be vastly profitable for the multinationals because the Iraqi government, Iraqi institutions are in such a weak position, but those contracts and their terms would last for 30 years, well beyond the current situation.
The United States had more oil imports from Iraq before the invasion in 2003 than after it. So it's not like the US invasion of Iraq helped the US consumers reach to more oil or anything. There were actually many other ways for the United States government to reach to the Iraqi oil, the same way that many other countries around the world actually depend on oil and on Iraqi oil. China, let's say, or Japan, many other countries depend on oil that comes from the Middle East, and they need to buy this oil that comes from the Middle East. But they don't invade the Middle East. We never saw Chinese airplanes bombing Baghdad. They buy it. This is the way that other nations decide to get oil. They buy it. And unfortunately, the Bush administration doesn't know the concept, doesn't really believe in the concept of buying oil. I think it would have been a way better deal to buy Iraqi oil and to try to stop interfering in the region to start with. That would have made everyone happier.
The rest of the world is very well aware of the fact that this was a war fought for oil, that oil is about corporate greed, but it's also about regional and global power and imperial power. And they know that's why we're there. If the war ends with U.S. corporations in control of Iraq's oil, we are in for a world of hurt.